The flickering candlelight cast long, dancing shadows across our dining room table. A scene meant to be intimate, celebratory. Our anniversary. My husband, Mark, had arranged a special dinner. A surprise after months of him being consumed by his latest project at work. My parents, bless their meddling hearts, had insisted on coming. Mark had hesitated, I knew. The subtle shift in his shoulders, the way his gaze had momentarily flickered towards the calendar on the kitchen wall, betraying his reluctance. But I'd brushed his concerns aside with a confident smile. It was our anniversary after all. Family. We were family, a unit, and a celebration should be shared. He'd been unusually quiet all evening, his smile a tight, almost painful curve, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for something lost or perhaps expecting someone unexpected. I attributed it to nerves, to the pressure of impressing my parents, who in their own way were rather formidable. They possessed a keen, almost surgical ability to scrutinize, to subtly imply where improvements could be made, always framed as genuine concern. I loved them dearly, of course, but their presence always felt like a subtle test, a quiet examination of our lives. Tonight, though, it felt different. A knot of unease had settled in my stomach the moment they'd arrived, a faint, persistent premonition I'd tried with all my might to ignore. The faint scent of their expensive perfume, usually comforting, seemed to carry an undertone of scrutiny. The elaborate meal, a multi-course affair prepared with Mark's usual meticulous attention to detail, the carefully chosen wine, a vintage I'd expressed admiration for months ago. It all felt a little hollow, a beautiful stage set for a play that was faltering. My parents made polite conversation, their voices smooth and measured, asking about Mark's work, his promotion prospects, their questions laced with a subtle but undeniable curiosity. They complimented the food, the ambience, the thoughtful arrangement of the flowers on the table, but their eyes, particularly my mother's, lingered on Mark a beat too long, a silent appraisal I'd grown accustomed to, a familiar dance of veiled judgment and unspoken expectations. After dessert, a delicate chocolate mousse Mark knew I adored as Mark cleared plates. His movements a fraction more hurried than usual, he excused himself, a vague explanation about having forgotten something in the car. A few minutes later he returned, his face unusually pale, his breathing shallow, almost imperceptible. He avoided my eyes, his gaze fixed on the polished mahogany of the floor, fumbling with a small worn leather bag I didn't recognize, its material smooth and supple from years of use, yet somehow alien in his hands. "What is it, honey?" I asked, my voice softer than intended, sensing the subtle but palpable shift in the atmosphere, the sudden tension that had nothing to do with digestion or lingering dessert. The air itself seemed to thicken. He didn't answer. He just stood there, gripping the bag as if it might slip through his fingers, as if it held some volatile substance. His knuckles were white, the tendons in his hand standing out in stark relief. Then, his voice raspy, barely a whisper that seemed to strain against the soft jazz playing in the background, cut through the carefully cultivated ambience. "I need to call 911. My parents exchanged a look, a silent, shared concern that instantly amplified my own alarm, a cold wave washing over me. 911? Mark, what's wrong? What's in the bag? My mother's voice, usually so composed, held a tremor. He finally looked at me, and the sheer, unadulterated panic in his eyes sent a cold dread through me, a sensation so visceral it stole my breath. It's not what you think. It's evidence." He didn't elaborate, didn't offer any context, just that single loaded word, a word that hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Evidence. He then turned his back to us, a protective, almost desperate gesture, as if trying to shield the bag, the situation from our view, and fumbled with his phone, his fingers shaking so violently he almost dropped it. The hushed, formal tone of his call to emergency services, the clipped phrases and urgent requests, was a stark, jarring contrast to the celebratory atmosphere we'd been trying to cultivate just minutes before. The careful performance of a happy couple, hosting esteemed parents, had shattered, splintering into 1,000 sharp fragments. The next few hours were a blur of hushed voices, the rustle of uniforms, the stark, impersonal beams of flashlights cutting through the dim light of our usually cozy home. Strangers in uniform moved through our living room, their presence an unwelcome intrusion. My parents hovered, their faces etched with concern, their well-meaning but ultimately useless questions a constant stream of gentle inquiries that did little to alleviate the mounting anxiety. Mark was a wreck, his usual composure completely gone, replaced by a visible state of distress. He mumbled about a mistake, a terrible oversight, something he discovered in the office a few days prior, tucked away in a place he'd never expected to find anything. He'd brought it home, intending to figure out what to do, he claimed, a desperate attempt to contain the situation. He said he'd found it tucked away in a shared storage closet, a forgotten item of a former employee who'd left under less than ideal circumstances. He'd panicked, he said, about his own involvement, about being seen with it, about the potential implications, the whispers, the accusations. My parents, bless them, tried to be supportive, their concern genuine, but I saw the flicker of something else in their eyes, something I'd feared my entire marriage, a subtle shift in their perception. Disappointment. A quiet, unspoken judgment that settled between us like a heavy fog. They were never overtly critical, my parents. Their disapproval was a far more subtle art form, a masterclass in passive communication. It was in the carefully worded questions, the extended silences that spoke volumes, the way they gently steer conversations away from certain topics, as if shielding themselves from unpleasant truths, from anything that didn't align with their carefully constructed vision of ideal lives. The evidence turned out to be a collection of sensitive, personal documents that had no business being anywhere, but locked away in a secure archive. It was an innocent discovery, Mark insisted, his voice strained, but the mere act of possessing it, even briefly, had made him look, in his own mind, complicit. The police were thorough, their questions probing but professional, their investigation swift. They ultimately found no immediate wrongdoing on Mark's part. He hadn't stolen anything, hadn't used the information. He'd simply foolishly brought it home in a moment of panic, a decision he now deeply regretted. But the damage to my perception of our reality was done. He hadn't trusted me enough to tell me. He'd chosen to carry this burden, this overwhelming panic, alone. And his first instinct when he found what he perceived as a problem wasn't to confide in his wife, his partner, his confidant, but to involve authorities, to create a scene, to call for external intervention. The days that followed were suffocatingly awkward. The air in our home thick with unspoken words and lingering tension. My parents left the next morning, their departure more hurried than usual, their usual lingering goodbyes replaced by a quick embrace and a promise to call. Mark was contrite, apologetic, a constant stream of "I'm sorry, and I should have told you." His words a desperate attempt to mend the fracture. He explained his fear, his humiliation, the potential repercussions at work if this had come out differently, if he'd been discovered in possession of the documents. He painted a picture of a man caught in a terrible predicament, desperately trying to do the right thing, however imperfectly, however misguidedly. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being deliberately excluded, of being an outsider in my own life. This wasn't just about a bag of documents. It was about a fundamental lack of trust, a deep-seated chasm that had suddenly opened between us. It was about him performing his marriage for my parents, a carefully orchestrated facade of marital bliss, and then when faced with a crisis, retreating into a world of secrets, a private chamber of fear and anxiety. He'd assumed the worst of me, or perhaps the worst of my parents' potential reaction to his situation, and that assumption stung more than any perceived professional misstep, any potential workplace scandal. He'd seen my parents as a threat, or at least a complication he couldn't be bothered to navigate with me by his side, a partner he could rely on. The anniversary dinner, the carefully curated intimacy, the romantic candlelight, it all felt like a stage he'd been playing on, and the bag of documents was the backstage drama he'd kept meticulously hidden. I watched him, this man I'd shared my life with for years, and saw a stranger, a man who had built walls I hadn't even known existed, walls that now seemed insurmountable. The turning point wasn't dramatic. There were no shouted accusations, no tearful breakdowns, no dramatic confrontations. It was a slow dawning realization that the foundation I thought we had, the bedrock of our marriage, was built on quicksand, shifting and unstable. One evening, about a week after the incident, Mark was recounting a story about his childhood, a rather embarrassing anecdote he'd never shared before, a story about a childhood crush and a mortifying public rejection. He was mid-sentence, his eyes shining with the vulnerability of finally opening up, of finally sharing a piece of himself he'd kept hidden, when I simply stopped him, my voice cutting through his narrative. "Mark," I said, my voice quiet, level, devoid of any emotion that might betray the internal turmoil. "I appreciate you telling me this. Really. But it's a little late, don't you think?" He faltered, his smile dissolving, replaced by a look of confusion. "Late for what?" "For building trust. I replied, meeting his gaze directly, my own eyes steady, unwavering. For sharing the things that matter, the things that scare you. The anniversary was supposed to be about us, about celebrating our connection. But you were more concerned with how my parents would perceive you, with what you were hiding, than with actually being present with me, with sharing your genuine self. He tried to argue, to explain his fear again, the same narrative he'd repeated endlessly, but I held up a hand, not in anger, but in a gesture of quiet finality, a firm but gentle stop. I'm not interested in the excuse, Mark. I'm interested in the choice you made. And the choice was to keep me in the dark, to exclude me from something that deeply affected you, and therefore affected us. That was it. The quiet action wasn't a grand gesture. It was the simple act of stating the truth, of refusing to accept his narrative of panicked innocence without acknowledging the underlying breach of trust, the silent betrayal. I didn't demand explanations or apologies beyond what he'd already offered in his torrent of regret. I simply stopped participating in the pretense, in the illusion of a perfectly balanced, trusting marriage. The consequences weren't immediate fireworks. It was a gradual cooling, a subtle but significant shift in our dynamic. My parents noticed. They'd always been attuned to the dynamics between Mark and me, their keen eyes missing nothing, and they sensed the shift, the new, almost imperceptible distance. My mother, during our weekly phone call, her voice tinged with concern, asked, "Everything all right with you and Mark, dear? You sound a little distant." I answered truthfully, my voice calm and measured. "We're working through some things, Mom." That was all. No elaboration, no seeking their counsel or their validation, no invitation for them to step into the growing void between us. Mark, for his part, seemed bewildered by my quiet detachment. He'd expected a flurry of tears, perhaps anger, followed by a more dramatic reconciliation where he would be the hero who had overcome his anxieties and reassured me of his love. Instead, he found a wife who was calmly, quietly, moving on from a relationship that had suddenly felt less substantial, less real. Our conversations became polite, functional, stripped of their former warmth and spontaneity. The easy intimacy we'd once shared, the comfortable silences filled with unspoken understanding, was replaced by a careful observance of boundaries, a polite distance. He'd call to discuss logistics, the mundane details of our shared life, and I'd respond with the same measured tone. The emotional space between us widened, not with conflict, but with a profound unspoken distance, a silent acknowledgement of what was lost. He tried at first to re-engage, to recapture the old dynamic, to reignite the spark, but I was no longer playing the same part, no longer willing to inhabit the same role. The performance was over. The revelation of his panic had inadvertently revealed his true priorities, his deeply ingrained instinct for self-preservation over partnership, and my response was simply to adjust my own expectations, to reevaluate my own position. The silence that grew between us was not an absence of sound, but an overwhelming presence of what was missing, a silent testament to a trust that had been irrevocably broken.